What if the perfect life was a perfect lie? Fiona Ashford had it all. A sprawling Manhattan penthouse overlooking Central Park. A closet bursting with runway couture and a billionaire husband, Merrick Holloway, who seemed to worship the very ground she walked on. She was living a fairy tale, the envy of New York's elite, complete with their first child on the way. But fairy tales are for children. The reality was late-night texts that were hastily deleted, the cloying scent of a strange perfume clinging to his suits, and a name whispered in his sleep. Serafina. Fiona decided to stop playing the part of the perfect trusting wife. While Merrick was busy wooing his mistress, she was quietly planning her exit. He thought he had everything and everyone under his absolute control. He was about to learn that a woman's silence is the most terrifying sound. The flash of paparazzi bulbs was a familiar symphony to Fiona Ashford. It was the percussive beat to the opera of her life, a life lived in the golden stratosphere of New York City's 1%. Tonight, the rhythm was particularly frantic. Merrick Holloway, her husband, had just donated a staggering 7 figures to the Metropolitan Museum's new conservation wing, and his arm, a bastion of strength and possession, was wrapped securely around her waist. She smiled, a practiced, gentle curve of her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was 7 months pregnant, her body a vessel for the next Holloway heir, and the custom-made Dior gown, a cascade of shimmering midnight silk, was designed to celebrate, not conceal the gentle swell of her belly. To the world, they were the ultimate power couple, Merrick, the charismatic razor-sharp CEO of Holloway Enterprises, a tech empire he had inherited and tripled in value. And Fiona, his elegant, serene wife, a woman who seemed born to wear couture and host galas that graced the covers of Vogue. The world, however, did not see the cracks in the gilded cage. It didn't see the way Merrick's thumb stroked the back of her hand a little too rhythmically, a gesture of placation, not affection. It didn't hear the silence that stretched between them in the back of the Maybach on the way home. A void no longer filled with easy laughter, but with the unspoken. Fiona had come from nothing, or at least what this world considered nothing. A librarian from a quiet suburb in Ohio, she had met Merrick when he'd given a guest lecture at Columbia, where she was finishing her master's in art history. He had been captivated by her quiet intelligence, her unfeigned passion for the Impressionists, a stark contrast to the brittle, calculating women who typically vied for his attention. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of private jets, Michelin-starred restaurants, and a proposal on a yacht in the Amalfi Coast. She knew the whispers that had followed her, the gold digger, the lucky librarian. She had ignored them, cocooned in what she believed was genuine love. But the cocoon had begun to feel like a cage. The change had been subtle at first, a slow erosion. It started with the late nights at the office that became more frequent. Then came the hushed phone calls he would take on the terrace, the city lights glittering behind him like 1,000 unsympathetic eyes. He'd return his expression a mask of nonchalance and murmur, "Sorry, darling. A crisis in the Singapore office." Tonight, the crack widened into a chasm. Her name was Serafina Dubois. Merrick, ever the magnanimous benefactor, had insisted on a tour of the newly endowed wing. And there she was, standing beside the museum director, the curator of the exhibit Merrick's donation had funded. Serafina was everything, Fiona was not. Where Fiona was classic elegance, Serafina was a bolt of lightning. She wore a blood-red dress that clung to her impossibly lithe frame, a slash of defiant color in a sea of tasteful black and navy. Her hair was a cascade of raven curls, and her eyes, dark and knowing, held a spark of dangerous ambition. "Merrick, darling, you came." Seraphina's voice was like warm honey laced with whiskey. She bypassed the museum director completely, placing her hands on Merrick's arms, a gesture of shocking familiarity. She kissed the air beside both of his cheeks, her movements sinuous and proprietary. "Seraphina, you've done a magnificent job. The collection is breathtaking." Merrick said, his voice a shade warmer than it had been all evening. "I aim to please," she purred, her eyes flicking to Fiona for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a look of apology or even acknowledgement. It was a look of assessment, of victory. "And this must be the lovely Fiona," Seraphina said, finally turning her full attention to her. "I've heard so much about you." The words were polite, but the tone suggested the things she'd heard weren't necessarily flattering. "It's a pleasure to meet you. The exhibit is truly special," Fiona replied, her voice even betraying none of the cold dread coiling in her stomach. Her hand rested protectively on her baby. For the next 10 minutes, Fiona watched them. It was a masterclass in betrayal. It was in the way Merrick's body angled toward Seraphina's, the way he laughed at her witty, slightly risqué remarks. A full-throated laugh Fiona hadn't heard in months. It was in the shared glance over a particular Rodin sculpture, a moment of silent communication so intimate it felt like a physical blow. They were speaking a language Fiona did not understand, a language of shared secrets and stolen moments. The final undeniable proof came later, back in the sterile silence of their penthouse. Merrick was in the shower, the sound of rushing water a temporary reprieve. Fiona was hanging up his tuxedo jacket when it happened, a faint, unfamiliar scent. It wasn't her perfume, a delicate Jo Malone scent he'd once claimed to adore. This was something bolder, spicier, a fragrance that smelled of confidence and sex. It was the scent of the woman in the red dress. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. She walked on trembling legs to his side of the vast, custom-made bed. His phone lay on the nightstand. For 3 years, she had never once touched his phone. It was a line she wouldn't cross, a testament to the trust she thought they shared. Tonight, she crossed it. His password was the date of their anniversary. The irony was so bitter, it tasted like acid. Her fingers shook as she navigated to his messages. The thread was right there at the top. Seraphina. She clicked on it, her breath catching in her throat. Seraphina. "Did your wife enjoy the show tonight? Merrick?" She was oblivious, as always. Seraphina. "Poor thing. You must be bored to tears. When can I see you? I need a proper thank you for the donation. Merrick Hampton's this weekend. My place. She thinks I'm going with the boys." Seraphina. "I'll wear the red dress. Or maybe nothing at all." Merrick. "I vote for nothing at all." Counting the hours. The messages went on for months. Banter plans, explicit photographs Seraphina had sent him. Pictures of her in lingerie, of her in his Hamptons beach house, of her wearing a diamond tennis bracelet Fiona now recognized as the one Merrick had claimed was a corporate gift for a client's wife. But the last message sent just an hour ago was the one that shattered the last vestiges of Fiona's hope. Seraphina. "She has no idea what you're really like, does she? The power you wield, the things you're capable of. I find it thrilling. Merrick. She only sees the man I want her to see." That's the key, my love. Control. It's all about control. Control. The word echoed in the silent room. He thought he was in control. He thought she was oblivious, a pretty pregnant doll in his carefully constructed dollhouse. A wave of fury, cold and clear, washed over Fiona, extinguishing the hurt. The old Fiona, the librarian from Ohio, would have confronted him armed with tears and accusations. She would have screamed and thrown things and demanded answers he would never give. But pregnancy had changed her. The quiet, constant presence of the life growing inside her had forged a new kind of strength, a primal protective instinct. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her child. She would not raise her baby in a house built on lies with a father who saw his wife as a pawn to be controlled. She placed the phone back on the nightstand, exactly as she had found it. She wiped the screen clean of her fingerprints. She walked back to her side of the bed and slipped under the cool, crisp sheets. The sound of the shower stopped. A few minutes later, Merrick emerged, a towel slung low on his hips, smelling of expensive soap that did not quite manage to mask the phantom scent of his mistress. He slid into bed beside her, the mattress dipping with his weight. He reached for her, his hand settling on her belly. He was kicking up a storm earlier. Merrick murmured, his voice thick with feigned paternal devotion. Big board meeting tomorrow. The merger is in its final stages. Then I have that boys' weekend to look forward to. A little R&R before the baby arrives and all hell breaks loose. Fiona did not flinch. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, a perfect imitation of the loving wife. You deserve a break, darling, she said, her voice smooth as silk. You work so hard for us. He kissed her forehead, completely assured of his own cleverness. I know, he said. It's all for you. You and the little one. As he rolled over and fell into the easy, contented sleep of a man who believed he had everything, Fiona lay awake, staring into the darkness. The tears she refused to shed burned behind her eyes. He was right about one thing. It was all about control. He had just made the fatal mistake of underestimating who was truly in charge. Her grief was already crystallizing into a plan, a strategy as cold and precise as the diamonds glittering in her jewelry box. He was planning a weekend with his mistress. She was planning a new life. And he would never see it coming. The next morning began like any other in the Holloway penthouse, a well-oiled machine of quiet luxury. The automated blinds ascended at 7 a.m. sharp, revealing a panoramic view of Central Park, awakening in the hazy summer sun. Their housekeeper, Maria, a stout woman with a perpetually worried expression, had already laid out the breakfast service on the Marble Island green juice for Fiona, a black Americano for Merrick, fresh fruit and the day's newspapers, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times ironed and folded. Merrick, dressed in a bespoke Tom Ford suit that cost more than Fiona's first car, exuded an air of supreme confidence. He was on the cusp of the biggest deal of his career, a multi-billion-dollar merger with a rival tech firm, Axiom Global. It was a hostile takeover he had orchestrated with predatory precision, and it would cement his legacy. He skimmed the headlines, took a call from his chief financial officer, and issued a series of clipped, decisive commands. He was a king in his castle, the master of his universe. He saw Fiona radiant in a cream-colored cashmere maternity dress, and his face softened into the mask of the doting husband. "Morning, darling," he said, kissing her cheek. "Sleep well, like a baby." She lied, her smile as serene and placid as the surface of a lake beneath which monsters lurked. She had not slept at all. She had spent the night staring at the city lights, her mind a whirlwind of cold, hard calculation. The hurt was a physical ache in her chest, but she had compartmentalized it, locked it away in a room she would deal with later. Now was the time for strategy. "Good girl," he said, patting her hand in that infuriatingly condescending way. "I have a beast of a day. Don't wait up tonight. I'll probably be late celebrating with the board after we sign the final papers." He glanced at his Patek Philippe watch. And then freedom. The Hamptons await. As soon as the penthouse door clicked shut behind him, Fiona's placid mask dissolved. The architect took over. Her first call was not to a divorce lawyer. That was too predictable. Merrick would have the best legal team money could buy on retainer, ready to crush her, to paint her as an unstable hormonal pregnant woman. No. Her first call was to a name she had filed away months ago from a quiet conversation she'd overheard at a charity luncheon for a women's shelter she secretly supported with her personal allowance. The women there, survivors of powerful, abusive men, spoke in code. They didn't recommend lawyers, they recommended problem solvers. Gavin Thorne was one such problem solver. He wasn't listed in any public directory. His firm, Thorne Security and Intelligence, operated out of a discreet office in a nondescript midtown building. He was a former military intelligence officer who now specialized in high-stakes corporate and domestic espionage for the ultra-wealthy. He was expensive, untraceable, and most importantly, ruthlessly effective. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice low and steady when he answered on the first ring. "My name is Fiona. I was given your number by a mutual acquaintance, Eleanor. I have a situation that requires the utmost discretion." There was a pause. "I know Eleanor," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone that inspired confidence. "How can I help you, Fiona?" They met 2 hours later in a private suite at the Carlyle, a place so steeped in old money discretion that no one would look twice. Gavin Thorne was not what she expected. He was of average height with thinning grey hair and a slightly rumpled suit. He looked more like an accountant than a spy. But his eyes, a pale, intelligent blue, missed nothing. They scanned the room, noted the exits, and settled on her with an unnerving focus. Fiona didn't cry. She didn't rage. She laid out the facts with the cool detachment of a CEO briefing her board. She spoke of Merrick Serafina, the text messages, and the upcoming weekend in the Hamptons. She handed him a burner phone she had purchased for cash that morning. "I don't just want confirmation of the affair, Mr. Thorne," she stated, her hands clasped over her baby bump. "I have that. I want a complete profile on Serafina Dubois, her financials, her connections, her history. I want to know what her endgame is. Women like her don't just want a rich boyfriend. They want a kingdom. I also want a full accounting of my husband's assets, specifically anything held in offshore accounts or through shell corporations that a standard divorce attorney might miss." Gavin listened, taking no notes, his gaze never leaving her face. "This is more than a divorce proceeding," he observed. "This is an exit strategy. My husband is a man who believes in control," Fiona replied, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He will try to destroy me. He will try to take my child. I need to ensure that when I leave, I have all the ammunition I need to protect myself and my baby. I want him to know that if he comes after me, I have the power to enact a policy of mutually assured destruction." Gavin allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Mrs. Holloway," he said the first time he had used her married name, I believe we can work together." The next 48 hours were a blur of clandestine activity. While Merrick was celebrating his merger, clinking champagne glasses with his board and sending flirtatious texts to Serafina, Fiona was methodically dismantling the life he had built for her. Guided by Thorne's encrypted emails, she began the silent exodus of her own assets. She had been smarter than Merrick ever gave her credit for. Over the past 3 years, she had quietly invested the generous allowance he provided, guided by her own research into the art market she knew so well. She had purchased several pieces by emerging artists' paintings and sculptures that had since quadrupled in value. These were assets in her name, Fiona Reed, her maiden name that Merrick had dismissed as her little hobby. She arranged for the pieces to be discreetly moved from their climate-controlled storage unit to a secure anonymous facility in Delaware. She opened a new bank account in a small independent bank in another state, again under her maiden name. She liquidated the stocks Merrick had gifted her, a patronizing gesture he'd made at the start of their marriage, and had the funds wired to her new account. It wasn't his billions, but it was a substantial war chest. Enough for a new life. Enough to fight back if she needed to. On Friday morning, just as Merrick was preparing to leave for the Hamptons, Thorne delivered his initial findings. The report arrived via a secure download link. What she read made the affair seem like a triviality. Gavin Thorne hadn't just confirmed the affair. He'd uncovered a much deeper conspiracy. Serafina Dubois was not merely an ambitious art curator. Her father was a disgraced French financier who had a long-standing vendetta against the Holloway family, dating back to a deal with Merrick's father, Arthur Holloway, that had gone sour decades ago. Serafina wasn't just sleeping with Merrick for his money. She was seeking revenge. Thorne's surveillance revealed her true game. She had been carefully feeding information about the Axiom global merger to a third-party corporate raider. The information was subtle, but critical details about internal anxieties on the Axiom board, knowledge of a slight overvaluation in Holloway's patent portfolio. It was inside information designed to weaken Merrick's position, post-merger making Holloway Enterprises vulnerable to a hostile secondary takeover by this raider who was secretly backed by her father's network. Merrick's boys' weekend was not just a romantic tryst. It was Serafina's final opportunity to extract the last pieces of sensitive information she needed before the deal was fully settled the following week. Fiona felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with her own betrayal. Merrick, in his arrogance and lust, had not just risked his marriage. He had jeopardized his entire family legacy. Serafina was not a mistress. She was a corporate assassin in a red dress. This changed everything. Fiona's plan for a quiet departure now had a new layer of complexity. She had in her possession information that could save Merrick's company. For a moment, she considered sending it to him anonymously. But why he had called her oblivious? He had plotted to control her. He deserved to face the consequences of his own monumental stupidity. Her resolve hardened. This information was not a lifeline for him. It was a life insurance policy for her. She created a digital file, a dead man's switch, containing Thorne's entire report on Serafina, the damning text messages, and a detailed summary of Merrick's hidden assets. She set up an encrypted email scheduled to be sent to Arthur Holloway, the entire Holloway Enterprises board, and the lead journalist at the Wall Street Journal in 30 days unless she manually postponed it. If Merrick tried to declare her mentally unfit, if he tried to launch a vicious custody battle, she had a button she could press that would not only expose his affair, but reveal him as a fool who had been duped by a vengeful mistress, nearly costing his family their empire. The final piece of her plan fell into place. Merrick came home early, buzzing with excitement. He packed a weekend bag, throwing in polo shirts and expensive loafers. He walked over to her, where she was ostensibly reading on a chaise lounge, the picture of domestic tranquility. He knelt before her, his hands cradling her belly. "Be good for your mother, little man," he cooed to her stomach. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with false sincerity. "I wish I didn't have to go. Mark is going through a tough time with his divorce. He needs his friends." The lie was so effortless, so smooth. Fiona had to admire the sheer audacity of it. She reached out and brushed a stray piece of hair from his forehead. "Of course, darling," she said, her voice a perfect blend of sympathy and love. "Go. Have fun. We'll be right here waiting for you when you get back." He gave her a long, deep kiss. It felt like being kissed by a corpse. As he walked out the door, weekend bag slung over his shoulder, a triumphant smile on his face, Fiona did not watch him go. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began her own final preparations. The architect had designed the escape. Now it was time for the vanishing act. The moment the solid oak door of the penthouse clicked shut, a profound and unnerving silence descended. For 3 years, this space had been filled with the sound and presence of Merrick. His booming voice on the phone, the clink of ice in his whiskey glass, the sheer gravitational pull of his ego. Now there was only a void. And in that void, Fiona moved with the silent, purposeful grace of a shadow. Her plan was a masterpiece of minimalism. Merrick would expect a dramatic, messy exit. He would expect rage tears, a trail of angry voicemails and texts. He would expect her to run to her mother in Ohio, or to the handful of society friends she had. He would look for her in all the predictable places, using his power and money like a blunt instrument. Fiona would be in none of them. She had a single medium-sized suitcase, a sturdy anonymous brand purchased from a department store with cash. Into it went not the Chanel jackets or the Jimmy Choo shoes. She packed 3 simple maternity dresses, comfortable flat shoes, a collection of prenatal vitamins, and the worn, dog-eared copy of Pride and Prejudice she'd owned since she was 16. She packed the ultrasound photos, tracing the grainy image of her unborn child with a gentle finger. Lastly, she took a small velvet pouch containing the simple gold locket her grandmother had left her, and a faded photograph of her parents on their wedding day, reminders of a life before the gilded cage. She moved through the vast, opulent rooms like a ghost, a silent observer of a life that no longer felt like her own. The walk-in closet, a space the size of her old apartment, was a mausoleum of couture. She ran her hand over a rack of gowns, each one representing a memory, now tainted by deceit. The silver dress from the opera gala, where he'd held her hand and whispered, "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," while already sleeping with Serafina. The blush-pink dress from their anniversary dinner, a night he had cut short for an urgent work call. She felt a pang, not of loss for the dresses, but of pity for the woman who had worn them, so eager to believe the fantasy. She left it all. The clothes, the shoes, the bags. She walked into her jewelry room, the walls lined with black velvet, the safe behind a mirror, holding millions in diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires. Gifts from Merrick. Shackles she now realized, not tokens of love. She touched nothing. Her final act was the most symbolic. She walked to Merrick's side of the bed, the place where he slept, the sound sleep of the morally bankrupt. On his pillow, she placed a small, elegant navy blue box with the word Cartier, stamped in gold. He would recognize it instantly. It was the box that had held the diamond tennis bracelet he had bought for Serafina. He would expect to find an angry note inside. But Fiona's weapon was silence. She opened the box and placed her wedding ring inside the flawless 8-carat cushion-cut diamond that had been featured in magazines, a symbol of their fairy tale union. She closed the lid. There was no note, no explanation. Just the ring in the mistress's box. The message was surgical in its precision, I know. And your ring is worth as much to me as the box you bought her bracelet in. At precisely 4:15 p.m., a black car service, booked under a false name by Gavin Thorne and paid for in cash, pulled up to a service entrance at the rear of the building. Fiona, wearing a simple black dress, a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses, slipped out unnoticed by the doorman, accustomed to her glamorous comings and goings. As the car pulled away from the curb, she took one last look at the gleaming glass tower that had been her prison. She felt a surprising lack of emotion. No sadness, no anger, just a quiet, steely resolve. She took the burner phone from her purse, opened it, and sent a single, pre-written text message to Gavin Thorne. The package is in transit. Then she powered down the phone, removed the SIM card, snapped it in half, and dropped the pieces into a public trash can as the car paused at a red light. She was a ghost. Merrick Holloway felt like the king of the world. The Hamptons' air was thick with the scent of salt and money. The weekend was unfolding exactly as planned. He had spent Saturday afternoon on his yacht, the Serenity, with a magnum of champagne, and Serafina draped across the deck, her lithe body glistening in the sun. She was intoxicating, a thrill ride of passion and danger that made his stable life with Fiona feel beige in comparison. He felt a fleeting, minuscule pang of guilt when he thought of his pregnant wife back in the city. But he quickly suppressed it. This was what men like him did. They had it all. The respectable, beautiful wife and the thrilling, fiery mistress. It was a perk of the job, a testament to his power. Fiona was safe, comfortable, and would never know. She was too sweet, too trusting. The thought was both comforting and, if he were honest with himself, a little boring. He drove back to the city on Sunday evening, feeling thoroughly satisfied, his mind already shifting back to business. He would walk in, kiss his dutiful wife, listen to her talk about her day, and the two halves of his life would remain perfectly separately managed. He strode into the penthouse just after 9 p.m., dropping his keys into the crystal bowl by the door. "Honey, I'm home," he called out the words, feeling theatrical and absurd in the sudden heavy silence. Usually he would hear her moving in the bedroom or the soft sounds of the television. Tonight, nothing. The air was still sterile. "Fiona," he called again, a flicker of irritation replacing his good mood. Had she gone to bed already? He walked through the living room and into their master suite. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. He flicked on the lights. The bed was perfectly made, pristine, and sitting directly in the center of his pillow was the small navy blue Cartier box. A cold fist of dread clenched in his stomach. She knows. His mind raced. How had he been careless? Had Serafina done something? He snatched the box, his fingers fumbling with the lid. He expected to see the bracelet, to find a note, a furious, tear-stained diatribe. But the box was empty except for her wedding ring. The sight of it lying there, cold and alone, was more terrifying than any note. It was a statement of utter finality. The silence was the message. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Fiona!" he roared, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. He tore through the penthouse. He checked the nursery, its soft yellows and whites, now feeling mocking and funereal. He ran to her closet. He stopped dead in the doorway. Everything was there. The rows of designer dresses, the wall of shoes, the purses arranged on shelves like museum pieces. Nothing was gone. It was as if she had simply evaporated. Panic, a raw, unfamiliar emotion for a man always in control, began to claw at his throat. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial her number. Straight to voicemail. "Fiona, call me. Now. This isn't funny." He called again. And again. Voicemail. He called her mother in Ohio. The woman's hesitant, frightened voice grated on his nerves. No, she hadn't heard from Fiona. Was everything all right, Merrick? He hung up abruptly. He called the few friends she had, society wives who exchanged pleasantries with her at luncheons. They hadn't seen or heard from her. Their voices were laced with a delicious, barely concealed curiosity. The gossip network would be on fire by morning. He stumbled back into the bedroom, his mind refusing to process the reality of the situation. She couldn't have just left. Where would she go? She had no money of her own. Not really. No resources. He controlled everything. Hadn't he? His eyes fell upon the building's internal security hub, a tablet on his nightstand that controlled everything from the lights to the cameras. With trembling fingers, he accessed the security logs. He scrolled back through the footage. And then he saw it. Friday, 4:15 p.m. Fiona. She was walking out of the service entrance. She wore a simple dress he didn't recognize and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured her face. She carried a single, unremarkable suitcase. She walked with a calm, unhurried gait. Just before she stepped into the waiting car, she paused and looked directly up at the security camera. The angle was grainy, but he could see her face. There were no tears. Her expression was one he had never seen before. It was not sadness. It was not anger. It was a look of absolute, chilling resolve. He finally understood. She hadn't run away in a fit of pique. This was a planned, calculated extraction. She hadn't just left him. She had escaped him, and the man who prided himself on controlling every aspect of his world had no idea where she was. He was holding a box containing a ring that symbolized a life he had just destroyed, and the silence she had left behind was the loudest, most terrifying sound he had ever heard. The panic was no longer a flicker. It was a raging inferno, and it was just beginning. For Merrick Holloway, the weekend's end did not bring relief, but the beginning of a suffocating private hell. The first 72 hours of Fiona's absence were a masterclass in the unraveling of a man who believed himself impervious to chaos. The silence in the penthouse was no longer a simple absence of sound. It was a living entity, a thick, cloying presence that clung to the marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows. It mocked him from the perfectly plumped cushions on the sofa, where she used to read, from the empty space at the breakfast bar, where her green juice should have been. It was the sound of his control evaporating into thin air. Sleep became a foreign concept. He'd pace the vast, darkened living room, the city lights glittering below like a galaxy of indifferent stars, his mind a frantic hamster wheel of questions. Where was she? How could she have done this? The image of her face on the security footage, that look of calm, steely resolve, was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. It was the face of a stranger, a woman he had lived with for 3 years, but had never truly known. His first instinct, the reflex of a lifetime spent solving problems with a checkbook, was to throw his immense power at the situation. On Monday morning, haggard and running on fumes and fury, he bypassed the police. A missing persons report on the pregnant Mrs. Merrick Holloway would ignite a media firestorm that would make the Axiom merger look like a footnote. Instead, he summoned the directors of Blackwood Global, a private security firm, whose name was whispered in only the most exclusive circles. They were ex-Mossad, ex-CIA corporate mercenaries who could find a ghost in a fog bank for the right price. "I want her found," he snarled, pacing in front of the two men in his office, their stillness a stark contrast to his frantic energy. "Her name is Fiona Holloway. She's 7 months pregnant. She's emotionally fragile, prone to hysterics, pregnancy hormones, you understand." The lie felt slick and greasy in his mouth, a desperate attempt to paint a narrative he could control. He needed to believe she was the weak one, the one who had broken, not the one who had so decisively broken him. The lead director, a man named Kalen with eyes as cold and grey as a winter sea, simply nodded. "We will be discreet. Do you have a recent photograph?" Merrick swiped through his phone, past dozens of pictures of Serafina, before landing on a photo from their last anniversary. Fiona was smiling, but he saw it now. The slight tension in her eyes, the practiced curve of her lips. It was the smile of a woman already planning her escape. "Find her," he repeated, his voice cracking with an emotion he refused to name. "I don't care what it costs." He instructed his lead attorney, the notoriously ruthless Marcus Thorne, to begin preparing for the inevitable. "When we find her," Merrick commanded, "we need to be ready. Build the case. She's had a mental breakdown, abandoned her husband and unborn child. We frame this as a tragic but necessary intervention. We need to establish that she's an unfit mother. For the baby's sake." He was already building the cage he would put her in upon her return, never once considering that she might have built her own fortress. The reports from Blackwood Global were a maddening exercise in futility. "The trail is cold, Mr. Holloway." Kalen reported back every 12 hours, his voice devoid of emotion. The car service was booked through a shell corporation that dissolved an hour after pickup. The driver was a one-time hire paid in cash, his memory of the client conveniently vague. The burner phone she used to make the initial contact was purchased at a bodega in Queens and never activated again. She has left no digital footprint, no credit card pings, no ATM withdrawals, no flight manifests. It's as if she ceased to exist at 4:16 p.m. last Friday. Whoever orchestrated this was a professional of the highest caliber. Merrick's frustration mounted with each report. Merrick Holloway, a man who could track global supply chains and stock market fluctuations in real time, was being bested. His power, his money, it was all useless against Fiona's silence. He was a king who had woken up to find his kingdom, his queen, and his heir had simply vanished, leaving him alone in his empty castle. His unraveling state did not go unnoticed at Holloway Enterprises. He stalked the halls of his office, his usual crisp authority replaced by a raw, feral anxiety. He snapped at his assistant for bringing him the wrong kind of water, was incoherent and dismissive in a board meeting about the final stages of the Axiom integration, and stared at his phone for hours, willing it to ring. In a moment of pure desperation, he made his second critical error. He called Serafina. He needed an anchor, an ally, someone to validate his outrage. "She's gone, Seri," he said, the words tumbling out in a ragged rush. "She found out about us," She packed a bag and just disappeared. He expected a gasp of shock, a murmur of sympathy. He expected her to soothe his frayed nerves with promises of their future together, now unencumbered. Instead, her response was chillingly practical. "Merrick, for God's sake, lower your voice. You sound hysterical," she said, her tone sharp, laced with irritation. So the timid little mouse finally grew a spine. "This is a gift, don't you see? It simplifies things. Now we can be together properly without all the sneaking around." The word gift landed like a physical blow. "A gift," he repeated, incredulous. "Serafina, my pregnant wife, is missing. I have no idea where she is or if she's safe." A sigh of exasperation crackled down the line. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. She's a grown woman. She's probably crying on her mother's sofa in Ohio. They always run to Mommy. She'll burn through her little bit of pocket money and come crawling back in a week. They always do." Her callousness was breathtaking. She spoke of Fiona as if she were a minor inconvenience, a household pest that had been temporarily removed. Then her voice shifted, becoming focused conspiratorial. "Now listen to me. I need you to get your head on straight. This is no time to fall apart. Did you get that final data point on the Axiom server integration? My contact is getting impatient. We need it by tomorrow to finalize the play." The whiplash of the conversation from his personal crisis to their corporate espionage knocked the air from his lungs. He stared at the phone in his hand, a sickening cold clarity cutting through the fog of his panic. He saw her, truly saw her for the first time. Not as the passionate, intoxicating lover, but as a predator. Her affection had been a performance, her passion a tool. He was a mark, a means to an end. His family's legacy the prize in a game he hadn't even known he was playing. He had risked everything. His marriage, his child, his empire for this. The thrill of their affair curdled into the bitter metallic taste of profound shame. He hung up without another word. That evening, the final devastating act of his personal tragedy began. A curt summons from his father's secretary. "Mr. Arthur Holloway expects you for dinner. 7 o'clock. Greenwich. Do not be late." The hour-long drive to the family estate in Connecticut felt like a journey to his own execution. He dreaded facing his father, a man forged from granite and sheer willpower who had built Holloway Enterprises from nothing. Arthur Holloway despised two things above all others: public scandal and private incompetence. Merrick knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut that he was about to be found guilty of both in the highest degree. He was shown not to the dining room, but to the study, a cavernous chamber of dark wood, worn leather, and the palpable weight of dynastic power. Arthur stood by the massive stone fireplace, a glass of Macallan in his hand. He wasn't alone. Marcus Thorne, Merrick's own lawyer, stood near the window, his expression funereal. "Your wife's attorney contacted my office this afternoon." Arthur said, his voice deceptively calm, the quiet tone he used before an eruption. He gestured with his glass toward a single sheet of paper lying on his vast mahogany desk. A preliminary separation notice. Very professional. Cites irreconcilable differences, with a footnote mentioning infidelity. Merrick's blood ran cold. "She has a lawyer already." Arthur let out a short, brutal laugh. "Oh, she has more than a lawyer, you monumental fool." He spat his composure, finally cracking his eyes, blazing with a fury that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. "She has Gavin Thorne." The name meant nothing to Merrick, but the way his father said it, the way Marcus visibly flinched, told him everything. Marcus Thorne cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Merrick," he said, his voice grim. "Gavin Thorne isn't a divorce attorney in the traditional sense. He's a specialist, a phantom. He handles sensitive, high-stakes situations for clients who need leverage, not just a settlement. He builds arsenals. If your wife has hired Gavin Thorne, it means she is not just filing for divorce. It means she's preparing for total war." Then came the death blow. Arthur picked up another thicker report from his desk and slapped it down. "And while you were off playing James Bond with your paramour, our new acquisition, Axiom Global, received a hostile takeover bid this afternoon. The offer came from a newly formed shell corporation, backed by a consortium of French investors." Arthur paused, letting the words hang in the air before he delivered the killing strike. His eyes chips of blue ice bored into Merrick. "The bid is surgically precise. It uses proprietary data about our merger's financial vulnerabilities, weaknesses in our patent portfolio. Data that could only have come from the highest levels of Holloway Enterprises. The man heading the advisory board of this new shell company is a recently rehabilitated financier. A man with a long and bitter history with our family. His name is Jean-Luc Dubois." The name hit Merrick with the force of a physical punch. Serafina Dubois. It all crashed down on him at once, a tidal wave of realization. The affair, the stolen data, the vengeful father, the disappearing wife. It was all one intricate, beautifully executed conspiracy. He hadn't just been having a fling. He had been the primary tool in the attempted destruction of his own company. "You risked this company." Arthur seethed his voice, a low, trembling roar that vibrated through the room. "You risked the legacy I spent 50 years building, the legacy I was to leave to your child, for a common trollop with a family vendetta. You let her play you for an absolute fool, and in your breathtaking arrogance, you lost the only person in your life who was ever truly on your side." Shame, hot and absolute, flooded every cell of Merrick's body. He stumbled back, sinking into a leather chair that felt as cold as a tomb. He thought of Fiona, her quiet strength, her unwavering loyalty. The way she had looked at him with a deep, unconditional love he had accepted as his due and never bothered to return. He thought of her oblivious nature and finally understood it for what it was, not weakness but a profound, calculating patience. She had watched him, she had understood him completely, and then, with the precision of a master surgeon, she had excised him from her life. Hundreds of miles away, where the pines of the Siuslaw National Forest met the rugged Oregon coastline. Fiona Reed. She was. Fiona Reed now pulled a soft woolen blanket over her legs. She sat on the porch of a charming, secluded rental cottage, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of salt and damp earth. Here the only sounds were the crash of Pacific waves against the shore and the cry of gulls overhead. She was not hiding. She was healing. She was taking long, solitary walks on the wind-swept beach, the sand cool beneath her feet. She was reading novels she hadn't had time for in years, talking to the active, growing baby inside her, and rediscovering the quiet, thoughtful woman she had been before Merrick Holloway. Gavin Thorne had arranged everything with silent efficiency. A local security team kept a discreet, invisible watch. She was for the first time in years completely safe. She knew Merrick would be in a state of chaotic panic. She knew his world would be imploding. She felt no satisfaction, no schadenfreude. She only felt a profound and surprising sense of peace. She had not left to punish him, but to save herself. His reckoning was simply the inevitable collateral damage of his own choices. Merrick finally returned to the penthouse in the early hours of the morning. The opulent space, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a vast, echoing mausoleum for his failures. As he walked past her side of the bed, his eyes caught something he had overlooked in his frantic searches. Lying on the nightstand, placed with deliberate care, was a single folded ultrasound picture. He picked it up, his hand, which had signed billion-dollar deals, without a tremor now shaking uncontrollably. He stared at the grainy black-and-white profile of his unborn child. This was what was real. This was the life he had so carelessly gambled away. This was what he had lost. Not just a wife, not just a company's security, but a family. His family. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, the sound unnaturally loud in the crushing silence. He flinched, his heart seizing. He looked at the screen. An email from an encrypted, untraceable address had just arrived. The sender was anonymous. The subject line contained a single, terrifying word, terms. His thumb hovered over the notification before he finally opened it. There was no greeting, no prose, just a link to a secure, password-protected document. He clicked it. It was Thorne's complete, unredacted report. Every damning text message between him and Serafina. A detailed timeline of Serafina's corporate espionage, linking her directly to Jean-Luc Dubois. A full accounting of Merrick's hidden offshore assets he thought were invisible. And at the very bottom, a short, unsigned message, its tone as cold and hard as a diamond. You will cease all attempts to find me. You will drop any and all future custody claims. A financial settlement proposal will be delivered to your attorney within the week. It will be non-negotiable. If you refuse these terms, if you attempt any form of retaliation, or if your investigators get any closer, the full contents of this file will be immediately delivered to your father, the entire Holloway Enterprises Board of Directors, and the Wall Street Journal. Your choice. You always wanted control. Here it is. The last vestiges of his panic and rage evaporated, replaced by a hollow, soul-crushing despair. There was no countermove, no legal loophole, no threat he could make. He had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and utterly defeated. The quiet, pregnant wife he had dismissed, betrayed, and underestimated had checkmated him from 1,000 miles away, protecting herself and their child with an armor of his own secrets. He sank to the floor, the glossy ultrasound picture clutched in his hand, the image of a future he had willfully and arrogantly destroyed. And for the first time since he was a small boy who had fallen and broken his arm, Merrick Holloway wept. The sounds of his sobs, swallowed by the vast, silent, and empty empire he had built. Merrick's world has shattered, his desperate search for Fiona just beginning. Will he find her? And if he does, can he ever earn back her trust? The saga of Merrick, Fiona, and Serafina is far from over. New secrets are waiting to be exposed, and the consequences of their actions will ripple through their lives in ways they can't even imagine. What do you think Fiona should do next? Should she forgive him or build a new life for herself and her baby far from his influence? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were hooked by this story of love betrayal and a woman's quiet strength, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a good drama, and subscribe to our channel for the next explosive chapter. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next.